Enda Harper thought her affair was her darkest secret until Chris Mallory's body surfaced in the river and her husband, Daniel, became the prime suspect in a murder no one could prove. Linda Harper was known in her quiet neighborhood as a devoted mother of two. She had lived in the same modest brick house for over a decade, and everyone who passed by in the mornings could see her in the front yard, tending to the flowers or sweeping the walkway before heading to work at the bakery downtown. She had an easy smile and a soft voice, the kind of person who remembered birthdays and always offered a kind word. People assumed her life was calm and steady, the picture of small-town comfort. But the truth was far different. Her husband, Daniel, worked long shifts for a construction company 2 towns over, often leaving before sunrise and returning well after dark. Sometimes he would be gone for days if a project required it. In the early years, Linda had filled the time with her children's school events, baking projects, and long evenings curled up with a book. Over time, however, the long stretches of solitude began to feel heavy. She found herself staring out the kitchen window in the evenings, the sound of the refrigerator humming louder than the silence in the rest of the house. The bakery was the one place where she felt seen. The regular customers made small talk, the smell of fresh bread filled the air, and the bustle of the morning rush distracted her from the loneliness waiting at home. It was there, among the rows of pastries and coffee cups, that Chris first appeared. He was a tall man in his mid-30s, with an easy grin and the kind of confidence that made people look twice when he walked in. He started coming in every few days, always ordering the same black coffee and croissant, lingering just long enough to exchange a few words with her. At first, Linda thought nothing of it. Customers came and went every day. But Chris had a way of making his presence feel deliberate. His comments were never too forward, yet they lingered in her mind long after he left. Weeks turned into months, and Chris's visits became more frequent. He began to come in during her shifts specifically, even when the bakery was quiet in the afternoons. He asked questions about her day, her family, her life in general, and he listened in a way that felt rare. She started to look forward to his visits, noticing the slight thrill in her chest when the doorbell chimed and he stepped inside. They began to talk more freely, slipping in personal details that went beyond casual conversation. She told herself it was harmless, that she was just enjoying a friendly connection. But part of her knew she was seeking something she wasn't getting at home: attention, validation, maybe even excitement. The first time they met outside the bakery was unplanned. Linda had been leaving work late on a Friday, and Chris happened to be walking past. He offered to walk her to her car, and their conversation flowed so easily that neither wanted it to end. They stood in the dim light of the parking lot for nearly half an hour, laughing at small jokes and sharing pieces of their lives they hadn't told anyone else. It was that night she felt the first pang of temptation, the quiet whisper of possibility. She went home to a silent house, her husband away again on another job, and lay awake thinking about the way Chris had looked at her. It didn't take long for their meetings to become intentional. At first, it was just coffee on her day off or a walk in the park when the weather was nice. She was careful, telling herself she was in control, that no one needed to know. But control began to blur when the casual touches, a hand on her shoulder, a brush of fingers, started to linger. Soon, they were meeting in places where they wouldn't be recognized, sharing stolen moments that made her heart race and her mind fog over. She felt alive in a way she hadn't in years. Every meeting seemed to pull her further from the life she knew, as if she were stepping into a different world entirely. Linda tried to ignore the small warnings in the back of her mind. Chris sometimes asked questions that made her uneasy, like the exact times Daniel would be home or what kind of security their house had. She brushed it off as curiosity, not wanting to spoil the feeling of being wanted. She convinced herself that Chris's interest in her personal life was simply a sign he cared. In truth, she didn't want to examine his motives too closely. It was during one quiet afternoon in the park that Chris hinted at something that made her pulse quicken, not with excitement this time, but with unease. He made an offhand remark about how much easier life would be if Daniel wasn't around. She laughed nervously, trying to steer the conversation elsewhere, but his expression didn't change. It wasn't the smile of a man making a joke. He said nothing more on the subject that day, but the thought lingered in her mind long after she went home. She tried to tell herself he didn't mean it, but she couldn't forget the steady, serious way he had looked at her. Still, she continued the affair, telling herself it was just a passing phase, something she would end before it went too far. She didn't realize she was already past the point of no return. The secrecy, the rush, the stolen hours, they had all woven a web she could no longer easily escape. What had started as an escape from loneliness was slowly twisting into something darker. And while she believed she was the one taking the risk, she hadn't yet understood that Chris had his own plans, and they were far more dangerous than she could imagine. Daniel Harper had always been a man of routine. His work kept him away from home for long stretches, and he trusted Linda to handle everything while he was gone. Over the years, this arrangement had become so normal that he didn't think twice about it. But lately, something felt different. On the rare nights he came home early, the atmosphere in the house seemed heavier. Linda no longer greeted him at the door with her usual warmth, and conversations felt forced, as though she were speaking from behind a wall. He noticed small changes: a new perfume he hadn't seen before, laundry done at unusual hours, and receipts tucked away in her purse. When he asked about her days, her answers were vague, filled with details that didn't quite fit together. Linda's own life was shifting in ways she didn't want to admit. Her meetings with Chris had grown more frequent, slipping into her schedule with unsettling ease. It was no longer just stolen moments. They were spending whole afternoons together, always careful to keep far from places where someone might recognize them. The more time she gave him, the more possessive Chris became. He began to message her constantly, his tone growing sharper. If she didn't respond right away, he wanted to know where she was at all times, even on days they couldn't meet. His questions about Daniel's work schedule became more insistent, and he often circled back to the same subject: how much better things would be without her husband in the picture. At first, Linda ignored the hints, choosing not to believe he meant anything serious. But one afternoon, Chris showed up outside the bakery unexpectedly, waiting for her shift to end. His expression was hard, almost angry, as he demanded she come with him. They drove to a quiet spot near the river, where he pressed her again about Daniel, asking when he would next be gone overnight. His persistence left her uneasy, but she didn't push back too hard. She feared that if she refused him outright, he might turn his intensity against her. She told herself it was safer to go along with his questions, even if she didn't give him clear answers. Meanwhile, Daniel began to quietly investigate his own suspicions. He didn't want to believe that Linda was seeing someone else, but the unease had rooted itself too deeply. Rather than confront her directly, he hired a private investigator from a nearby city to watch the house and follow her when she went out. The investigator quickly confirmed what Daniel had feared. Within 2 weeks, he had photos of Linda meeting Chris in different locations: restaurants, parks, and places far enough from town to avoid attention. Daniel received the evidence in a thick envelope, each picture a sharp blow to the trust he thought was unshakable. But Daniel didn't act immediately. He studied the photos again and again, not just to confirm the betrayal, but to understand the man she was seeing. He noticed Chris's body language, the way he stood too close, the way his hand seemed to grip Linda's arm rather than rest on it. There was a tension in the images that disturbed him, something that felt more dangerous than an ordinary affair. He began to think about what kind of man Chris might be and what his intentions truly were. As the weeks passed, Chris's pressure on Linda intensified. He began talking in more direct terms about removing Daniel from her life, painting a picture of a future where they could be together without secrecy. Linda tried to keep their meetings lighter, steering conversations away from his darker suggestions, but it was becoming harder to ignore the edge in his voice. He seemed less interested in her as a person and more focused on controlling her circumstances. The thrill she once felt had soured into a gnawing anxiety that followed her home at night. At home, Daniel played the role of the patient husband, careful not to reveal how much he knew. His silence gave him the advantage, allowing him to watch Linda's behavior closely. He noticed her phone never left her side and that she often stepped outside to take calls, lowering her voice as she paced the yard. When he asked casual questions, she responded with the same vague answers, her eyes flicking away from his. The distance between them grew until their conversations became little more than necessary exchanges about the children or the bills. One Friday evening, Daniel returned home earlier than planned. Linda wasn't there, and her car was gone. He sat in the darkened living room, waiting. When she finally came through the door hours later, she seemed startled to find him there. Her explanation was hurried, and he didn't press her for details. But in that moment, Daniel made a decision. He would confront the man himself. He wanted to see what kind of person had inserted himself into his life and whether Chris would back down if challenged. What Daniel didn't know was that Chris had been planning his own confrontation. He had begun following Daniel's movements, watching his comings and goings, and keeping track of when he left for work. He believed Linda's reluctance to commit fully to him was because of her husband's continued presence, and he saw removing Daniel as the only solution. Linda, caught between the two men, felt the walls closing in. She was terrified of losing her marriage and her family, yet equally afraid of what Chris might do if she ended things abruptly. By this point, the private investigator had gathered more than enough evidence to confirm the affair, but Daniel wasn't ready to take it to the police or a lawyer. He wanted to handle it himself. The simmering tension between the three of them was reaching a breaking point, even though none of them said it out loud. Every decision Linda made felt like a gamble, every day another step closer to something she couldn't quite predict. The stage was quietly being set for the night when everything would spiral out of control, a night that would begin like so many others but end in a way that no one could take back. The danger was no longer hidden in hints or suspicions. It was waiting, just beyond the edges of their ordinary lives, ready to shatter everything. Rain fell steadily on the quiet streets, turning the pavement slick and casting distorted reflections of streetlights in shallow puddles. Linda sat in her car in a dimly lit corner of the park, watching the wipers sweep back and forth. She had been sitting there for nearly 10 minutes before Chris arrived, pulling his black sedan up beside hers. His usual confident swagger was gone when he stepped out, replaced by an unsettled energy that made her stomach tighten. He paced a few steps before getting into her car, his movements restless, his eyes darting toward the dark tree line. From the moment he sat down, his words tumbled out quickly, almost without pause. He told her he had been following Daniel, learning his routines, and knew exactly when he would be home and when he wouldn't. He spoke as though this was a normal thing to share, as if it were a practical step in a plan they had both agreed on. Linda felt her chest tighten, her pulse thudding in her ears. She tried to keep her voice steady, masking her alarm with careful nods. But inside she was scrambling for a way to slow him down, to shift the conversation away from the dangerous territory it had entered. She didn't know that elsewhere in town, Daniel was sitting in a diner booth across from the private investigator. The investigator slid a folder across the table, the manila edges worn from handling. Inside were the latest photographs. Linda at the park with Chris, leaning close under the cover of a shared umbrella. Linda walking into a motel room, her head lowered. Chris waiting in his car outside her workplace. Daniel stared at the images without speaking, each one confirming the betrayal he had already accepted. But there was something else in the photos that unsettled him even more: Chris's expression, his constant awareness of his surroundings, his stance that suggested calculation rather than carelessness. Back in the car, Chris shifted the conversation. He began talking about the last time he had seen Daniel in person, though Linda didn't remember mentioning that they had ever crossed paths. He described watching him from across a parking lot, noticing the way he carried himself, even the kind of jacket he wore. His voice carried a mix of contempt and fascination. Linda sat rigid, her fingers gripping the steering wheel. Though the engine was off, she could feel the walls closing in. Every meeting with Chris seemed to bring them closer to a line she couldn't afford to cross. And she no longer believed she could simply step back when she wanted to. Chris's agitation grew as the rain pelted harder against the windshield. He pressed her about Daniel's schedule for the coming week, asking for exact dates and times. When she hesitated, he leaned in slightly, lowering his voice, and told her that she needed to decide how much longer she wanted to live under Daniel's control. The words were sharp, leaving no room for misunderstanding. Linda felt trapped, knowing that refusing him outright might provoke a side of him she hadn't seen yet, but giving him the information could lead to something irreversible. While Chris was pushing her for answers, Daniel was making his own move. After leaving the diner, he drove to Chris's apartment building. He parked on the opposite side of the street, watching from the shadows. Hours passed before Chris's car returned. Daniel stepped out into the rain, crossing the street without hesitation. The confrontation began with nothing more than words, but those words carried years of built-up frustration, betrayal, and anger. Chris didn't back away. Instead, he met Daniel's fury with his own, stepping closer until the space between them was charged with something dangerous. No one could say for certain what happened in those next moments. There were no cameras, no witnesses close enough to hear the exchange. All that is known is that Chris never made it inside his apartment that night. The following morning, his absence was noted when he failed to show up for work. His phone went unanswered, and his car sat parked exactly where it had been the night before. When Linda learned that Chris had vanished, her first reaction was disbelief. She tried calling him repeatedly, each call going straight to voicemail. The relief she felt at not having to deal with his pressure was quickly replaced by an icy dread. She suspected Daniel might have had something to do with it, but she couldn't bring herself to ask. The silence between them in the days that followed was suffocating, both of them moving through the house like strangers, each carrying secrets neither wanted to voice. The police became involved within 48 hours of Chris being reported missing. Detectives visited Linda at the bakery first, their questions polite but pointed. She admitted to knowing Chris, describing their relationship as a brief friendship, carefully avoiding details. She didn't mention the late-night meetings, the conversations about Daniel, or the way Chris had been pressing her for information. Daniel was also questioned. He told the police he didn't know Chris personally, though his calm demeanor barely concealed the tension in his jaw. There was no evidence to connect him to the disappearance at that point, but the lack of a solid alibi planted seeds of suspicion. The investigators noted the cool distance between husband and wife, sensing that both were holding back more than they were willing to share. Days turned into a week with no sign of Chris. Rumors spread quickly through the town, fueled by whispers about Linda's sudden change in demeanor and Daniel's increasingly withdrawn behavior. People who had once admired the Harpers for their stability now speculated about what might have happened behind closed doors. The truth remained hidden, but the damage was already done. The quiet routines of their lives had been replaced by constant tension, the kind that made every glance, every unanswered question, feel like a threat. The disappearance of Chris was no longer just a missing persons case, it was a shadow over everything Linda and Daniel did, a reminder that their lives had taken a turn from which they could never return. And though no one yet knew the full story, the night of the confrontation had set something in motion that could never be undone. The river wound its way through the outskirts of town, its dark water moving slow and heavy after days of rain. On a gray morning 2 weeks after Chris disappeared, a fisherman noticed something caught against the low branches near the riverbank. At first, he thought it was just debris carried downstream, but as he drew closer, the shape became unmistakable. What he had found was not a piece of driftwood or tangled fabric, it was a body. The police were called immediately, and by midday, the area was sealed off with bright yellow tape, uniformed officers pacing the muddy bank as the coroner's van waited nearby. Word spread fast, and before the official announcement came, half the town already suspected who it might be. When the identity was confirmed, the shock was mixed with grim inevitability. It was Chris. The autopsy revealed blunt force trauma to the head as the cause of death, the injury so severe it was clear it hadn't been accidental. The medical examiner estimated he had been dead since the night he vanished. The currents of the river had carried him far from where the violence had occurred. Linda heard the news at work. The bakery was nearly empty when she saw the headline on her phone, the words blurring as her mind struggled to process them. She felt her chest tighten, her breath shallow. Chris's death was not something she had ever imagined would happen, not even when his threats had begun to unnerve her. She thought of the last night she saw him, the tension in his voice, the pressure in his questions. The relief she felt at his absence now twisted into guilt and fear. The police arrived at the bakery within hours. They questioned her again, their tone sharper this time. The discovery of Chris's body had changed everything. No longer were they simply looking for a missing man, they were investigating a homicide. They asked her to go over every detail of her relationship with him, pressing for timelines, locations, and reasons for their meetings. She stuck to her story, admitting only to knowing him casually and seeing him a handful of times outside of work. The detectives didn't look convinced. At home, Daniel was no more at ease. The police visited him too, asking about his whereabouts on the night Chris went missing. His answers were measured, but he had no strong alibi. He claimed to have been at home alone, watching television, but there was no one to confirm it. The detectives took note, their interest in him clearly deepening. They didn't accuse him outright, but the questions lingered long after they left. The town turned its attention to the Harpers with the quiet cruelty of speculation. Neighbors who had once waved from their driveways now avoided eye contact. Customers at the bakery whispered when they thought Linda wasn't looking. Every sideways glance felt like an accusation. The air in the Harper home grew heavier each day, conversations clipped and perfunctory. The children sensed something was wrong, though neither parent offered an explanation. The investigation gathered momentum. Detectives traced Chris's movements in the days before his death, speaking with co-workers, friends, and anyone who had seen him. A pattern emerged. His obsession with Linda was no longer speculation but a documented fact. Several people recalled him mentioning her by name, speaking about her in a way that suggested possession rather than affection. What unsettled the detectives most was that he had spoken to at least one person about resolving her situation, a phrase that now seemed ominous. Despite uncovering Chris's fixation, the police were equally interested in Daniel. His sudden interest in hiring a private investigator, combined with the timing of Chris's disappearance, placed him under a shadow of suspicion. The investigator was eventually contacted by the police and reluctantly handed over the photographs he had given Daniel. The images didn't prove Daniel's involvement in the death, but they painted a clear picture of motive. They showed betrayal, opportunity, and the kind of emotional provocation that could lead to violence. Linda was caught between fear for herself and fear for Daniel. She didn't know the full truth of what had happened that night, but she had her suspicions. Daniel's silence and the way he avoided certain questions only deepened her unease. At times, she wondered if his quiet was meant to protect her as much as himself. Other times, she wondered if it was simply guilt. As the days wore on, the media picked up the story. Headlines framed it as a tale of a small-town affair turned deadly, with Linda cast as the central figure. The coverage was relentless, reporters staking out near the bakery and the Harper home. Every photograph of her was scrutinized, every public appearance dissected for signs of remorse or deception. She felt as though she were living under a magnifying glass, her every move documented and judged. The police eventually called both Linda and Daniel in for separate formal interviews. They made it clear that they were looking at the case as both a domestic dispute and a crime of passion. To the detectives, the pieces fit too neatly: a wife's affair, a jealous husband, a sudden disappearance, and a body found with fatal injuries. But without physical evidence directly linking Daniel to the killing, the case remained circumstantial. Privately, Linda's thoughts drifted often to the moments she had ignored the first time Chris asked about Daniel's schedule, the way his mood had shifted from charming to demanding, the chilling remark about life being easier without her husband. She couldn't shake the thought that if she had ended things sooner, if she had cut him off completely, none of this would have happened. But the past was set in stone, and the reality before her was impossible to undo. The weeks after Chris's body was found were filled with tension and uncertainty. Each knock at the door made Linda's stomach twist. Each phone call from an unknown number made her fear it was the police with new evidence. The Harpers lived in a state of quiet dread, both waiting for the moment when the fragile balance would tip, and one of them would be pulled into the storm of a trial. But the most unsettling part for Linda wasn't the investigation itself. It was the nagging feeling that there was more to the story of Chris's death than even she or Daniel knew. That night by the river had left no witnesses, but she couldn't escape the sense that the truth might be far more complicated than the neat conclusions everyone around them was drawing. The trial began in the heavy heat of summer, months after Chris's body had been pulled from the river. The courthouse steps were lined with reporters, their cameras snapping at anyone connected to the case. Every morning, the Harpers walked past the clicking shutters, their faces fixed in neutral expressions. Neither of them spoke to the press. Inside, the air was cooler but no less tense. The prosecution painted a picture of betrayal, jealousy, and rage. They claimed Daniel had discovered his wife's affair, confronted Chris, and killed him in a fit of passion before disposing of the body. It was a simple story, and it fit neatly with the photographs, the testimonies, and the timeline. The defense countered with the argument that there was no physical evidence linking Daniel to the crime. No fingerprints, no DNA, no witnesses placing him with Chris that night. They suggested Chris had enemies outside of his entanglement with Linda. He had debts, they claimed. He had been in trouble before. They reminded the jury that the burden of proof lay with the prosecution. Daniel sat quietly through it all, his hands folded on the table, his gaze fixed straight ahead. Linda was called to testify early in the trial. She took the stand with her heart pounding so hard she thought her voice might shake. The prosecutor asked her about her relationship with Chris, how it began, and how it ended. She kept her answers brief, offering no unnecessary detail. When asked if she believed her husband could have killed Chris, she hesitated just a fraction too long before answering no. That pause hung in the air like smoke, noticed by everyone in the room. The courtroom was filled with familiar faces, neighbors, old friends, and people from the bakery who had once greeted her warmly. Now their eyes followed her every movement, measuring her words against the image they'd formed in their minds. She could feel their judgment pressing down on her, even as she stepped down from the witness stand and returned to her seat in the gallery. Midway through the trial, a surprise witness was brought in. It was a man who lived near the river, someone who had been walking his dog on the night Chris disappeared. He claimed to have heard raised voices coming from the direction of the old boathouse, followed by a loud splash. He couldn't identify the voices, but he was certain one of them belonged to a man, the other to someone he described as quieter, more cautious. The prosecution seized on this, suggesting the quieter voice could have been Daniel, trying to calm Chris before the situation escalated. The defense argued it was too vague to mean anything. Despite the lack of direct evidence, the tide of public opinion was against Daniel. Each day of testimony seemed to reinforce the idea that the affair had set off a chain of events that could only end in violence. The photographs from the private investigator were shown to the jury, projected onto a large screen so every detail was impossible to ignore. In one, Linda and Chris were seated at a small table in the corner of a dim cafe, their hands brushing. In another, they were standing close together on a quiet street, her expression unreadable, his eyes fixed on her like he was the only person in the world. When the closing arguments were delivered, the prosecution's voice was steady, confident. They asked the jury to see the story for what it was: a man betrayed, pushed to his breaking point, eliminating the rival who had threatened his family. The defense reminded them that suspicion was not proof, and that to convict without concrete evidence would be to gamble with an innocent man's life. The jury left to deliberate, and the waiting began. Hours passed, stretching into a full day. Linda sat in the hallway outside the courtroom, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. She tried not to think about what the verdict might be, but every creak of the door made her pulse spike. Daniel sat beside his lawyer, his expression unchanged, though the faint lines around his eyes seemed deeper than before. When the jury returned, the room was silent except for the shuffle of papers. The foreperson stood, holding the slip of paper that would decide everything. The words came slow: "Not guilty." A murmur ran through the courtroom, part relief, part disbelief. Daniel exhaled quietly, his shoulders lowering for the first time in weeks. Linda felt her knees weaken, though she wasn't sure if it was from relief or something darker. The trial was over, but the truth of that night remained buried. Daniel never spoke about what happened, not to Linda, not to anyone. The police officially closed the case, lacking the evidence to pursue it further, but whispers persisted. The town's curiosity didn't fade, and every so often, someone would bring up Chris's name, their tone tinged with both pity and suspicion. Life after the trial was not the same. The bakery's business suffered. Friends they had known for years stopped coming around. Linda found herself lying awake at night, listening to the rhythm of Daniel's breathing beside her, wondering if she truly knew the man she had defended in court. She thought often of the witness by the river, of the voices he heard. She wondered if the quieter one had really been Daniel's, or if someone else had been there that night, someone no one had considered. Months later, a storm washed away part of the riverbank near the old boathouse. Children playing there found a rusted metal pipe lodged in the mud, its surface stained with what might once have been blood. The police took it, but no new charges were filed. Without fresh evidence to connect it to Chris, it became just another unsolved thread. Still, the sight of the discovery in the local paper made Linda's stomach turn. She folded the paper in half and threw it away without reading the rest of the article. Daniel never mentioned it. He never brought up Chris again. The subject seemed to hang in the air between them, unspoken but ever present. Sometimes in the quiet of the kitchen after the children had gone to bed, Linda would catch him staring into the distance, his jaw tight, his thoughts far away. She didn't ask what he was thinking. She wasn't sure she wanted to know. The years passed, but the night of Chris's death remained a fixed point in Linda's life, a shadow that stretched long into the future. Whether Daniel was guilty or not no longer mattered in the eyes of the law, but in her own mind, the questions never stopped. She lived with them the way one might live with a locked door in their home, never opening it, never peeking inside, but always aware of what might be waiting behind it. In the end, the truth stayed in the river with Chris, carried away by the current beyond reach. The town eventually moved on, new scandals replacing the old, but for the Harpers, the story never truly ended. It lingered in glances, in pauses between words, in the quiet weight of shared secrets. And in that silence, Linda knew, was the real verdict, one that no jury could deliver.